What if I told you there are 2 new ways to update your editor experience in Rescript? Trust me, with these new tricks, you'll be entering the avatar state in no time. For the first technique, we're going to update our rescript.json. We're going to add a editor section, and in there, we're going to use the autocomplete node. We have keys that correspond to types. So this is a promise of t, an array of t, or a geolocation, but prefixed. And in this case, we're going to have a list of modules to also complete from. So how does this look like? If I have a promise, like my example over here, if I say my promise, when I press dot, one new cool thing is that I get completions for all the functions that take that promise as the first argument. So in this case, we can see that, oh, I have my promise.catch, and I have other things. Basically, everything that's in the standard library is going to be auto-completed because that takes the promise as the first argument. But you can also see that I have this promise x from extension, and this is my own module. So if I have a alternative binding or just really something else that takes promise as the first argument, by adding this JSON configuration where I say this type also should complete from this module, I can add additional functions like this foobar. If I now try and see where my foobar is, I can just type it, and there's auto-completion for my own functions that take type as the first argument. Same principle with arrays, so this works for all primitive types or custom types. We basically want to have a second element function, which takes an array and returns an option. This is just like a shorthand helper. Or we want to have an unsafe variant. So one option would be like, oh, let's raise a pull request and get it in the standard library. But this might just be a little bit too specific to your project. So what you can have here is that you define all these things. We can see that at unsafe is being auto-completed, and second element is also being auto-completed. So this can really lead to a richer experience of your own helper functions that you might have. The configuration of the type name works on the internal name of the fully qualified type. So in case of a primitive type, that's just going to be its alias. But when I have this geolocation type, which comes from the Web API project, so the Web API, for those who don't know, is the experimental Web API bindings. I basically add that, but that package, if you were to look in the node modules, C for Web API, that will have a namespace, which is this Web API. And because it has a namespace, it has an influence on how the type is going to be defined internally, so to speak. So if I go back to our rescript.json, you'll see that it is part of the geolocation API, but it has a namespace. So I need to add this -web API and then put a dot for the type itself. So that's a little tricky, but don't worry, it's documented. And afterwards, we have the same experience. I'm just grabbing the navigator geolocation. And if I press G, then I can use my extension to get my current position as a promise. Another new trick you can use is using the @editor complete from functionality. So when you're in control of the types, what you can do is add an additional attribute and get autocomplete for functions that take your type as the first argument, but live inside of a different module. Let me just give you an example to be a little bit more clear about this. So we have the Firebase config, which is this type, and we see in the app module, I'm having an initialize app where I can pass in a config and get an app back. So if I were to create an app, I can say firebase.config, and then when I do a dot, I can actually only access the properties of the config type. So yeah, what can I do with this? When I enter the arrow, I don't really get any completion at all. So what we can do now is do an annotate of this type, editor complete from, and then tell it from which module it should also autocomplete some functions. So in this case, we added app over here. We see that this takes the first config as the first argument. So when I now press a dot, you can see that this app initialize was actually autocompleted, and I now have my app type. And this is really wonderful stuff. The same thing can be done over here. So we have this type app from the app module, and then in Firestore, we can get a Firestore by trading the app for the Firestore. And a little later, we can do the same thing with the functions. So over here I have functions, and there's also a get functions that take an app. So what I can do is I'm just gonna annotate the app type over here, editor complete from. In this case, we're gonna have 2 modules. So one was Firestore, and the second would be functions. And when I do that now, what I can see is if I want to go grab a store, we can see get store, get functions, and it works exactly as you expect it would be. So in case of the functions do take another parameter. So get functions still needs that region. But again, autocomplete got you covered, and it can say region Europe, for example. So this is a great way to extend autocomplete when you're defining types in different modules. Sometimes you just want to define all your types in one file, but then do completions with other files or helper files. And the editor complete from really allows you to enable a better discoverability of your library code. Short and sweet, that's how I like it. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, leave a comment. Let me know how it goes with your experience, and until we meet again.